you filthy degenerates and nerds. Hey, if it's one thing I'm known for, it's my love of fantasy. The last 10 years, I've really come out of my Star Wars nerd phase in high school and middle school. Mostly because Disney killed my childhood with their SJW politics and terrible writing. But I've been falling in love with worlds like D&D, Lord of the Rings, Warhammer, Fantasy, Elder Scrolls over the last 10 years. I've become a huge D&D nerd. I've really fallen in love with all forms of fantasy, urban fantasy, D&D, all the great there's been a lot of good fantasy shows that have come out in the last 10 years. I really enjoyed the D&D movie. I really enjoyed The Magicians. I even enjoy The Witcher, okay? I know I'm going to get so much hate for this. I enjoy The Rings of Power and Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones is still better than Rings of Power, but I've enjoyed. I'm a glass half full when it comes to most media, especially if it's like fantasy media. Sci-fi, though, has gone to the shitter with the new Star Trek and Star Wars. But modern day fantasy has been great with shows like Critical Role, video games like Elder Scrolls Online, or Dragon Age Inquisition. It's been a golden age for fantasy these last 10 years. I've really enjoyed the stories, the sheer like forms of media fantasy has created for itself. D&D is on the rise. It's more popular than ever. Despite the evils and dark plans of Wizards of the Coast, those people are, well, Hitler would gasp at their evil. But there's been a lot of good fantasy shows and games have come out, and they've really expanded the medium. People are now more into magic and fantasy than ever, and I love it. I fucking love it. It's beautiful. It's nerdy. It's debaucherous. It's like going to Salem, Massachusetts, high on acid, and having sex with Slanesh. Okay, that's how great it is. Well, yeah, but here's the thing: fantasy, despite all the things that really stood up about fantasy to me in the last 10 years, is the sheer universality of it. How it's become so broadened, and so many people from across demographics have become huge fans of D&D. The sheer like market, the critical role market, the people that are finding creativity and membership and welcome in these nerdy spheres of fantasy and fiction, and how it's become so inclusive, and so many people are making content, making their own fantasy shows. Felicia Day, the Guild. There's so many great female heroes, and so many great stories people are telling with their art, their cosplay, their LARPing, and how this medium has become so welcoming and so open to so many people, and found so many new expressions of inclusivity and welcoming and creativity. I love it. Something I don't like, though, I will say this: as much as I love modern day fantasy, there are some things that do stand out to me. And this video is kind of giving a rant, long like comparison video between old school fantasy versus the more new school fantasy. And just for the record, I love the D&D movie, but there are some things that were glaring about it. I prefer, in some ways, I know so many people hate me for this. I know I'm gonna get so much hate mail, and furries are gonna send me bomb threat. Probably gonna send me pipe bombs. Giggity. But the old D&D movie to me had more charm than the new one. Okay, let me explain. It felt like a homebrew. The new D&D movie felt like a pre-made Forgotten Realms product turned into a film. And that's why I prefer the older one over the newer one, because I do a shit ton of homebrew. I like me some dark furries coming after. My homebrews are dark and fucked up, and that's why homebrew is where D&D is at. I'm sorry. Homebrew is where D&D is at. The Forgotten Realms is amazing, and I do love Dragonlance, but homebrew is what D&D is known for and what it should be known for. And that's the thing with modern day fantasy. It's so good at immersion. It's so great at creating shared experiences, worlds we can consume with modern day technology, immerse ourselves in, and escape from. The escapism from everything from D&D to video games to ESO to World of Warcraft to Star Wars: The Old Republic to shared LARPing or even Roll20. These fantasy worlds are great. They're more alive than ever. We see a rising indie market in the last 10 years of of content. We see that Critical Role. We see that with so much, and it's great. I fucking love it. But the thing that I will say, I somewhat dislike, somewhat, about modern day fantasy is how dark and brutal it can get, and that we've lost some of the whimsy I often saw with earlier fantasy as a kid. There were shows in the 90s and 80s, everything from the Conan books to there was a it was a lot more kid friendly and more friendly in general to everyone in some ways than a lot of fantasy shows on nowadays are, like Game of Thrones. As much as I love Game of Thrones, it could take a note from Xena Warrior the Princess or Hercules or the Beast Slayer or like all the generic, what we would call campy, shitty, weird, cheesy fantasy shows I grew up with, or they could be like a lot of other fantasy shows in that time that, it was more, I wouldn't say child friendly, it was just more digestible, and it they didn't have to go all out to sell and bring people in. And I still think that, honestly, more so science fiction, but fantasy still gave some bangers like Xena, The Seeker's Apprentice. And we did have a lot of these good fantasy shows back then. They're more digestible and still consumable by everyone. As much as I love Game of Thrones, it has a place in my heart. Um, I just think fantasy needs, especially in cinema, books, it's very different, but in media, like, and even video games, it's slightly different, but especially in cinema, TV shows, it is very hard to create a whimsical, magical experience and not be bogged down by modern day politics and modern day. Because the woke has destroyed a lot of modern day fantasy. There's exceptions, yes, but I look back at the early 2010s and the early 2000s and 90s. I look at The Hobbit, I look at Lord of the Rings, and how this was such a good fantasy show. The Hobbit, especially, it was the most modern but still good version of and relevant version of Middle Earth that we've ever gotten. And Rings of Power, I want to see where this goes. I want to see where Rings of Power goes. Crucify me, Tolkien nerds. March out with your fake Templar blades and your anti-porn stickers and come at me, you fucking Templar bros. Come the fuck at me. Tolkien only can suck my nads, but Tolkien purists are the most pathetic people on the planet. But aside from that tired aside, I think The Hobbit did really, really well, especially Lord of the Rings, that I grew up with, because it brought diversity, the right kind of diversity in modern day storytelling to the Middle Earth that we always wanted. It didn't sacrifice the whimsy, the deep magic and metaphysical, like deep modern day mythology of the Silmarillion or the books, but it found a way that modern day audiences can identify with this mythos, and you don't have to be a Catholic Jesus freak to enjoy and immerse yourself in Middle Earth. You can be a pagan and enjoy these books. You can be a pagan and enjoy this universe. And Peter Jackson did a great job of that with the Lord of the Rings cinematic universe he was handling back for there was a cinematic universe, really. And maybe with the new Lord of the Rings media coming out, we can find that a golden age of Tolkien cinematic universes out there, which could really help a lot of people. And then I still think the best thing that ever could have happened if TSR was allowed to make Lord of the Rings content and make their own fantasy universe out of the Middle Earth canon and be allowed to make stories that take place after Lord of the Rings. I still think making content that takes place after the books and the end of the movies would have been so great, and they could have. There's so many ways they could have done it, but unfortunately, the Tolkien estate are very, very snooty, very, very self-righteous, and I have several issues with them as a modern day Tolkien fan. If you're an old school Tolkien fan, whatever, is your prerogative. But back aside from that tirade, aside from that tired, I will say modern day fantasy lacks the uniqueness of the fantasy that was so successful in my early childhood, from Xena Warrior Princess to Lord of the Rings to a lot of good fantasy shows out there back then. And I'm mostly speaking from live action cartoons. That's very little changed. Like actual fantasy shows, like Adventure Time stuff like that. That's always managed to like appease to everyone. But what really stood apart for the true fantasy, the greatest sources of fantasy, that we should mine correctly, whether it be Lord of the Rings, whether it be the truly deep fantasy series like Middle Earth. This is such a rich mythology. It is a universe of whimsy and magic and deep mythological meaning. It is a modern day monomyth, a modern day world history and worldview and creation story. The Silmarillion is literally straight up a fantasy Bible, okay? It's a fantasy Bible that's actually pretty cool and fun to read, and that doesn't have talking snakes, incest, and talking beavers that love Jesus. It's a form of fantasy that, if that's how the Bible is actually written, the Christianity would actually be the most popular, powerful religion on the planet, and our worldview wouldn't be so puritanical and tainted. But whatever. Um, the thing with these modern day fantasy epics, whether it be Lord of the Rings, whether it be, I'm not gonna say Narnia, but like not the edgelord shit that is Song of Ice and Fire either, but these true ancient mythologies, like from Dune to Lord of the Rings to Star Wars, even these, and even Star Trek. These are such deep and beautiful universes, and there's other universes too, like Forgotten Realms. I will put on that list. And Elder Scrolls is a weird category that is a very modern day mythology, but has not been tainted by modern day politics, and that's so interesting. Or The Witcher, I'll put that in the list as well. Witcher definitely falls under that list of classic fantasies from the 20th century. These fantasy worlds are so deep and built to instill meaning in us, and that's the meaning of magic, and that's what fantasy exists more so than sci-fi does. Sci-fi is meant to ask questions in the modern day world, and is more meant to be relevant to the political social themes than fantasy is. Sci-fi is the questions of why we should do this, how are we doing this. Fantasy is a deeper thing. What is the core of my life? What is the core ethos and mythos of this world around us? It still does the job that the fantasy myths of thousands of years ago still do. We just don't see these beings as gods anymore because humans evolved. I still believe in Jesus and Yahweh, but whatever, come at me. But the thing with these ancient myths, they still keep alive the ancient stories and mythologies and beliefs and ideas that we all grew old, that we lived our lives by, that gave us hope, that gave us archetypes to live by and follow and breathe. And modern day fantasy is great at immersing yourself in fantasy worlds and creating fantasy worlds, but I don't think it carries the deep inner core meaning that comes from the sheer birth of creation that is imprinted on human souls. I really think if we were to take the modern day fantasy elements of like D&D, with all our modern day fantasy magic technologies of D&D and video games, and use that and give us the ability to truly lock into that core, like role play, but also role play. I know they're so diametrically opposed, because role play is its own thing. Role play, if we were to create fantasy mediums, whether it be television, video games, that still brought back the core stories and themes and beauty and truth of these ancient mythologies, these deep core stories that tell us deeper meanings behind everything for their stories. Harry Potter's also a part of that. But I think if we were to take these ancient mythologies, but take the modern day technology, these ancient myths, and take the modern day technologies and mediums we have, we could create a true golden age of fantasy that could enrich the human experience. If we use all the streaming and modern days like sociology that we use to market and tell these stories to, and how we used to tell these stories, both the true deep core beauty of storytelling that Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter gives us, the sheer monomyth, we could create a golden age. But unfortunately, woke has tainted fantasy and made it too consumerism, make it too consumerist, and I really fucking don't like that. And this is coming from someone who markets himself in nerdy gamer journalism. I really don't like that. That's why we can't mess with these ancient stories, these modern day monomyths. The more we try and turn them into things we can package and sell, which, I know that's part of capitalism. I get that, and that the only way to make a profit and keep the world going nowadays is to use capitalism. I get that, but I fucking hate it. But once again, I'm not getting into a talk about capitalism, but here's the thing. I'm rambling as shit, but let me go with this. If we were to take the market abilities we have now and go back to these ancient fantasies and be modern day fantasy builders and multiverse builders with the technologies we have, we could create a golden age of magic and whimsy in the world. And the thing with woke, and I'm talking about Hollywood woke here. You're trying to take these beautiful like worlds and fantasy creatures from dragons and elves and orcs and ancient gods and beautiful cities of elves, and you're turning them into products to sell people and get your brand sold and to make a quick buck. Whereas I think the early fantasy writers and content creators I loved, even Lucas to an extent, and Peter Jackson, they were trying to tell a story and try and create an experience and create a mythos that will live inside you and will shape you, while still making some money off of it. But not in a greedy way, but in an artistic way. I want to build this world. I want to see the world change for my vision. And very few directors and content creators in the fantasy industry really have this ability. Example of trying to sell ancient classical fantasy and magic to a modern day audience. The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, was perfect at this. They knew how to tell the core story of Lord of the Rings and its mythos while still being able to reach out to everyone. I love that. I mean, here's the thing with role-playing games I really enjoy. Anyone can do anything. Anyone can be whoever they want to fucking be. Anyone can identify however they want to identify. Every role-playing game that you play in or that you live stream, you're telling a story and you're putting yourself in the role of said story. You are the main character. You are Frodo Baggins. You are Luke Skywalker. And that is so freaking cool and brilliant in modern day fantasy. Has a lot of advantages over the classics of Tolkien and C.S. Lewis going there. But what I'd like to see going forward is maybe create role-playing games they're not just about having fun and role-playing, which is awesome. I do that all the time. But role-playing games, they have such a deep mythology. They give you opportunities to see how you would do in like these moral, political, social situations, and how you should rise above, how you should be the hero of your own journey. Then a role-playing game that inspires you. And you don't just role-play in, but inspires you, A role-playing game that can give you the deep core meaning of being the hero and rising above the chattel that is everyday fucking humanity. And going on that journey. Getting out of the Hobbit house. Going to steal the gold from the dragon. Telling you to go save the kingdom of the hobbits from the evil beast folk, Stories that inspire you and that you can role-play in, but also you can also get a deep sense. Like a role-playing game with a deep sense of lore and like presence like Lord of the Rings or Star Wars, but still you can make your own choices in this world, and it can be so good for therapy, so good for building moral character. I get more of my morality from role-playing games like Mass Effect or Dragon Age than I will ever get from like some generic Sunday sermon by a racist Catholic priest, all right? Call me a heretic for that. I don't fucking care. I'm a hermeticist. And for me, fantasy is a modern day form of magic. Fiction is a way of altering your energy, altering your state of mind. Role playing games can be a great way for you to alter your state of mind and act out in these fantasy worlds how you would act if global chaos and global evil was on the rise. Lord of the Rings kind of did that. The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings are a way of telling the story of World War II and World War One, and was Tolkien saying evil must be opposed. And there were role playing games that brought back that core truth that there is evil in the world and needs to be opposed, and encourage you to either be the fallen hero like Anakin Skywalker, or be the person who rises above the evil and do that like a party dynamic. Like I kind of do with my own D&D games. This past year, I've had two of my players who've turned their back on the rest of the party and their faction and gone over the dark side. One became a Sith general. One became a Sith cyborg general. One became a demonic prince. See, that's what we need more of. We need, like, having the party split in a storytelling element can be great, okay? Having the party split on loyalties and fighting amongst themselves can be great. Imagine the Fellowship fell apart and some side with Sauron, some side with the forces of good. You know, it'd be awesome. It really would. What I really hate about modern day fantasy is just the sheer. I know I talked about the consumerism, but the sacrificing story for identity politics. And if it's a true monomyth story, anyone will be able to relate to it. You don't need to dumb it down or alter the lore to make it more applicable to modern day audiences. And you can. I'm not saying like we had to like tell these stories the way they were told 100 years ago. You can still tell the story of Lord of the Rings or story of Star Wars, especially Star Wars, and still reach out to a huge fan base and make it relevant to everyone if you do it right. There's adapting media, which is something we should always be doing. But trying to sacrifice core story elements and lore for the sake of just, this doesn't work anymore, it won't sell as much, that is sheer stupidity. It's woke capitalism, which is something that really fucked over a lot of people during the pandemic. Like, pandering to... I shouldn't say pandering, that sounds so asshole-ish. Like, claiming we are for these groups of people, LGBT, African Americans, and just doing it for cheap jokes or characters, it's so cheap. The media content creation I started in the pandemic was so cheap, and it didn't know how to tell a story. But then there are quote unquote woke fantasy and sci-fi series I really do like. Cyberpunk and Baldur's Gate 3 do a really good job of being very progressive while still having that core awesome story and that core awesome brilliant world to explore and stories to be told. And everything I don't like about modern day fantasy, my biggest issue with it, and there's good points to this, there's bad points to this, telling fantasy stories and sci-fi stories simply to be a critique of modern day society, which I know, I'm not saying that's not a bad thing. I like critiquing modern day society all the fucking time. But if we're making that into what fantasy is all about, then we lost the roots of Tolkien, Frank Herbert, and Lucas. If all fantasy and sci-fi is meant to be a critique of modern day politics, then it's no different than sci-fi. And fantasy has always been more in touch with classical mythology and its purpose than sci-fi has. And in closing, I want fantasy to go back to its core roots while still being applicable to modern day audiences. I want to return to the fantasy of the early 2000s and late 90s with Xena, Warrior Princess, Lord of the Rings, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, because he's had very modern, diverse casts and modern issues, but they didn't sacrifice the soul of the monomyth. They didn't sacrifice the soul of the hero's journey, which this hero's journey is the most adaptable story in human history. Every culture has their own version of it. Every culture has their own nuance of it, and that should be acknowledged and treasured. But we shouldn't destroy that core DNA, which is so applicable to so many different stories, just for the sake of social media brownie points or getting the extra dollar of the woke SJW morons. Go back to telling stories that inspire people and give you a form of escapism. And give you stories and monomyths to live by. Get rid of all this freaking jokes like the new Charmed, which I fucking hate, making a feminist motif every 5 seconds, which again, I'm not bashing feminists. But there's cringe online feminism, cringe online wokeism that has made its way into Hollywood, and it's really destroying a lot of films and stories. And they're not saying there aren't plenty of good stories. I love Baldur's Gate 3. I love the new Lord of the Rings. A lot of people are giving me shit for that. I like the Rings of Power. But in general, let's go back to what fantasy used to be: whimsy, joy, escapism, and giving us reason to hope and things to believe in. That's something I'd like to see happen. And I'm stoked for the direction D&D is going in. I really am. I'm really stoked for the direction fantasy role-playing games are going in. I wouldn't mind, though, if the fantasy film industry got back some of its magic. I wouldn't mind that. We need more Harry Potter, more Lord of the Rings than we do more Game of Thrones or The Witcher. That's just my opinion. I still enjoy these fantasy shows I just gave shit to, but they could do a lot better. Until next time, folks, stay sane, go slay the dragon, and get the hell out of the Shire. Peace.